Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome back to this session. Money Matters. Yes, my name is Matthew Mitten. I'm a partner at Second Sight, and we specialise in financial well-being. And I suppose just very briefly the background as to why we're here with regards to the mental health conferences. A couple of years ago, Johnny and Neil spoke at an event I was at, and very quickly became apparent to me, opened my eyes really to the mental health arena. And as soon as you start talking about mental health and financial well-being, the light goes on that those two are very closely linked. And I think even in the space of a year, we were at the last event last year, in the space of a year, financial well-being now does appear to be a thing. And it gives me great pleasure to be hosting today with our other panelists. So started from the far side over here, we have Rohan. Rohan Kallicharan, is that right? Got it?
Yep, absolutely.
Who's head of people and talent at Receipt Bank. He's here as his own personal story that he's going to share with us about finances and mental health. We have Vicky Rose, who's the head of HR operations for Norton Fullbright, a city law firm, so very much giving us an employer perspective. And we have Iona Bain as well, who is the founder of Young Money blog and agency and the author of Spare Change. So she's the voice of the younger generation who often are the ones that we worry about the most, I think, when it comes to money matters. So perhaps just to get things started, I think maybe we could just ask quite a simple question, which is, how do finances affect our mental health? And how does mental health affect our finances? The two are so closely linked. We worry about it a lot. It's a chronic stressor, I think. So how can we identify these stresses and equip ourselves to handle them? Rohan, perhaps you could answer that one to begin with.
Okay, so from my point of view, actually, financial recklessness was almost a symptom of my illness. So I was diagnosed with bipolar disorder type 1, and that was actually after living with the illness for 13, 14 years without diagnosis. During that time, I managed to create an absolute whirlwind of financial disaster, is the only way that I can put it. And I suppose what that creates then is the obvious, for me in my 20s and early 30s, that state of comparison with my peers. On the outside, they're doing very well. Myself with this illness as yet undiagnosed, going on spending sprees with money that I didn't have. I know it sounds flippant now, but age 19, back in 1993, I managed to spend a student loan of £1,000 in 3 hours. Believe me, back in those days, that was quite some achievement.
Wow.
So, the reality is, it was just this vicious circle of getting further and further into debt, not being able to hold down a job as well, and that depressive spiral begins to create a burden on those around you. I'd borrow what I couldn't pay back, and essentially I would say the financial issues were at the heart of my multiple suicide attempts before recovery.
Right, thank you, Rohan. And at the time, it sounds like there was not a lot of resource available for you to turn to. No one spotted some of these symptoms, these signs?
Absolutely not, no. I think back then, obviously, we were much less educated around mental well-being, around what the symptoms looked like, and my financial recklessness, I think the manic phases around bipolar, going into a depressive state and rapid cycling afterwards, it just looked like actually totally irresponsible behaviour. I looked like someone who would go off on these absolutely ridiculous sprees and then have regret and guilt afterwards, unable to live with the consequences. And actually nothing could have been further from the truth. I was totally unable to control what was going on, and that was what really led to where I was.
So in the modern workplace, we're talking today a lot around how we can support people with mental health issues. How could the workplaces better support staff? Because again, it's quite a fine line. Sometimes employers don't want to tread into that area because it feels like it's personal. It's not an employer's responsibility. Vicky, do you have a view on what employers can do to help support their staff?
Yeah, I think it's about probably giving access to lots of things. So at Norton Fullbright, we provide quite a big wellbeing programme, part of which includes the financial wellbeing. And also, in addition to just kind of giving sort of talks and seminars around sort of some of these issues, we'll also give access to things like pension surgeries or, I don't know, will writing, mortgage advisory clinics, so that people at least know that there are these things available. And we've offered sort of financial concierge services as well before, so that people can speak on a one-to-one basis and actually understand a little bit more about perhaps what they need to be thinking about or saving. And I think just like we've been talking all day, obviously, in the same way people don't want to come forward and just say, I've got a mental health issue. Nobody wants to come forward and say, I'm in massive debt either, because they just don't want to be perceived sort of, in the wrong way. So I think the more that we can do, again, just to give kind of, as I say, access and education around it, the better. And I think, equally just seeing the importance of some of the benefits that we have in place, like long-term sickness, for example, or, private medical and things, that without those could be really critical if somebody hasn't got that in place.
Thank you. I think that one of the things that certainly became clear to me when I was looking at this is that a lot of the language that's associated with mental health is very similar to the language associated with financial health, is the stigma associated with potentially the embarrassment or the guilt that you might not be good at managing your money, and particularly if you're in a position of authority or senior in the business, then it could be a little bit embarrassing coming forward with some of these things. And I think debt's one area that obviously gets quite a lot of coverage, but I think there's lots of other areas of financial well-being that also need to be looked at depending on which part of the scale you are. We talk about mental health affecting everybody from top to bottom. I think financial well-being is the same, whether it's dealing with your day-to-day finances or whether you're trying to keep up with the Joneses. I think it affects all people. I mean, young people in particular obviously are often cited as an area for concern. Iona, if you, obviously, with your research and things that you've done into the workplace and with younger people, what's your view with regards to their sort of state of their financial health?
Well, I think in the last 8 years, ever since I started the Young Money blog, there's been a real sea change in how we see young people and money. Young people used to be a very neglected demographic, neglected by the media, neglected by the financial industry, and to some extent as well, perhaps neglected by their employers or taken for granted by their employers as well. But there has been a big change since I started Young Money, because there's now a realization that being good with money is not necessarily understanding all the ins and outs of how savings and debt products work, although that all does matter. What's fundamental and what is the foundation of being good with money is having a positive relationship with money. And one of the problems that I have in my job is when I speak to young people, I realize that from a very early age, they have never had any conversations with anybody in their life about money, any really meaningful conversations. So they don't know how to talk about their needs versus their wants. They don't know the basics about money until they get to that point where they suddenly have to start dealing with it, and they end up making a lot of mistakes and learning the hard way. They're very uncomfortable talking about how much they earn, and they're very uncomfortable talking about this really toxic relationship that they have with their finances, and that can often affect so much of their work life as well, their productivity, their promotion prospects as well. So if you come from a more disadvantaged background, that discomfort with talking about money might then also lead into you not being prepared to, go into conversations with your employers about your wages and your terms of employment, and have those honest conversations that you need to have. So there's all sorts of factors that can drive that toxic relationship that we have with money. But I guess the good news is that actually you can start to address that later on in life, and I think employers can play a really big role. And in fact, they should play a big role because of developments like auto-enrollment, which has seen millions of workers being automatically put into workplace pensions for the first time. That means workers saving into a pension. They need to know how it works, and they need to know how to get on top of their finances as well.
So I think auto-enrollment is a good example of where something that's been introduced has worked really well in terms of getting people in. I think you could argue it hasn't worked so well in getting people engaged. That bit might come a bit later. Yeah. And I would say that the longer-term finances for people who have been on the radar of businesses for a long time. Pensions have been around a long time. And arguably, they were more effective when somebody worked for you for 40 years, because then you look after them in their old age. Nowadays, people move around every 2 or 3 years. Is that the most useful tool to attract and retain staff going forward? I think that there's a debate to be had there. Certainly, it seems now that there's more emphasis now on helping people with the short-term and their medium-term financial savings as well. So let me ask a question in a different way around. Rather than the employer and what boundaries they shouldn't cross, do you think employees trust their employer when this sort of information comes out? Because it is so personal, how likely are employees going to be to want to engage with an employer when it comes to any sort of financial well-being strategy?
Just speaking from the millennial perspective, I think my generation is trusting of employers and that they are prepared to have that open relationship with their employers. And they expect so much now from the world of work. They expect so much more from their employers now. And I think we're very good at talking about, all the health benefits of belonging to having a corporate gym membership and so on. But what is not quite as addressed is this financial well-being element, but that too could be incredibly helpful for your average young employee who is being perhaps auto-enrolled for the first time, who doesn't have any savings, who is borrowing potentially too much, living beyond their means, and has generally just got quite out of kilter in their relationship with their finances. It would be wonderful if every young employee in the country could just have a sit-down session with somebody. It doesn't have to be a full-fat financial advice session, but just somebody who can kind of get them on the straight and narrow, understanding the basics, getting them saving, getting them paying down their debt, and generally just helping them feel a bit more in control.
Getting people into good habits early on, I think, is what's really, really important. Today is about helping to provide solutions in the workplace. Would be good to get some questions later from the audience, so please do remember to use your Slido if you've got questions that you would like to ask the panel. We've talked a little bit about young people in the workplace, but obviously it's not just the millennials that are stressed about money. There's some recent research that talked about the demographic, sort of 35 to 50, I think it was, that had borrowed money from the bank of mum and dad in order to help themselves. So it's clearly not just the younger people as well. So what can we be doing? Should we be aware of the people that sort of a generation above, my generation probably? What are the issues that are facing those people?
Yeah, I think we're sort of seeing more and more, people finding themselves in different situations and perhaps not where they expected to be, maybe through divorce or different circumstances. And we've run some sessions around, well, actually, what do you do if you suddenly find yourself single, for example, when actually your will needs to be changed and different things need to happen around your mortgage and that kind of thing. So I think there's quite a different aspect now in that perhaps age group, sadly, but true, that we do need to be addressing some different types of subjects because of those, say, different sort of life circumstances.
And Rohan, from your personal experience, that wasn't around that sort of support, and now obviously in an HR role, how does it work now?
Yeah, absolutely. So if I look back at the time, we mentioned pensions. As I began to recover from my illness, I wish that I'd had someone within our finance team, HR team, to be telling me, do not opt out, because actually I was just about, beginning to get out of huge debt. And obviously, I'm still living hand to mouth at that point. So actually, 2% or whatever it may have been at the time seemed a lot of money to be giving back into my pension. Whereas, with hindsight now, if only I'd have left that 2%, it wouldn't have taken me so long to get to a point where, okay, I'm in my mid-40s now. Financially, credit ratings are back actually fairly good. Married, earning a very comfortable salary, but actually, if I look at my future now, where's the savings? So I'm starting where I should have been, aged 21, wherever, at the age of 45, which it's life. I'm not going to cry about it. However, I wish someone in that middle ground had just said, stop, think. What are you doing, and actually help to plan. But there is still a stigma because, even with myself, I had a conversation with a colleague in my previous job who his previous employer had misadministered his private medical at work, which meant he was actually left with with an annual tax fee that he had to pay back after he'd left to the tax man. And actually, it was very difficult for him to come to HR and say he felt, although it was no fault of his own, he felt very challenged to have that conversation. And actually, like anything, it's societal, it's, across workplaces, regardless of age, regardless of gender, regardless of industry, money is still something that people find very, very difficult to speak about. How do we empower people to have those conversations? He only had that conversation with us eventually because he knew they would have contacted our finance team to make a deduction from his salary. So actually, how do we get to that point where we're having that conversation, empowering people to come and say, okay, look, this is going on. How can you best advise me to move forward from this?
I mean, something that occurred to me last year at this event, I was talking to one of the delegates in the break, and they work for the Samaritans, and he was saying to me that 1 in 5 calls to Samaritans are because people are in financial crisis, and it kind of brought it home to me then, how important this subject is. But obviously, there's a range of people's, needs and a range where people are hopefully not at that point that we need to help. So there was a conversation then around prevention. I think we talked earlier about in other sessions mental health first aiders, but again, that's at the point when someone's desperately in need of some help. Yeah. How can we do more to get to the preventative stage? What would be the ideas that we could, encourage the people in the room to think about when it comes to prevention?
I think just picking up on your point, first of all, on the AP, for example, I think, historically, EAPs have probably just been thought of, I'm feeling down, I need to speak to somebody, and it's perhaps relationship or it is mental health, but actually they're there for debt problems. They're there to speak to them about a landlord that they've got problems with. So I think, perhaps triggering and tapping into that EAP might be useful because they are there for a whole host of different subjects and not, as I say, perhaps what they originally were kind of brought in for. But I think just being able to provide that open culture, being mindful of, this time of year, for example, and it sort of sounds perhaps a little bit silly, but things like Secret Santa, you're asking people to come to Christmas parties, pay for things, and we don't know what everyone's circumstances are like, and that actually becomes a real issue for people. Yeah. And even just kind of getting into the office and paying, our season tickets are hugely expensive, and again, that can cause some problems when we've got somebody that wants to work from home a bit more regularly because it's just going to save on her travel. So I think if we can be more open and to those sorts of situations, provide that agile working, and that again is perhaps something that we can sort of help with.
Yeah, I think the EAP is a particular interest as well. I'm quite passionate about that in the sense it's, for most businesses, it's a free resource, and they can provide one-to-one counselling on all different aspects. And someone was talking a while ago about how if you're not feeling very well physically, you see a doctor, or you might have an annual health check. If you're physically maybe we should be checking in once a year for our mental health or our financial health as part of that overall health check. And I think EAP is an area that all businesses could probably do more to promote. Again, it feels like it's something that's only ever there when people are in crisis, whereas actually I think it's potentially a really good preventative tool as well.
I also think it's really helpful to have role models within the workplace, or sometimes coming in from outside the workplace, that are similar to your employees, are similar age, similar life stage, who your employees can really relate to, who might be able to share practical strategies for how to manage the kind of financial problems and worries that your employees will have. Because I think that peer mentors and role models are so important. When I started the Young Money blog, one of the things I really struggled with was the fact that there weren't really any young people talking about money, talking about financial well-being in the public sphere. It seemed to be a space that was populated by older people, many of whom were really well-meaning and really cared a lot about young people, but in all honesty, were just a bit too far ahead in their life and had too many different concerns from younger people to really resonate with me. And so I found that one of the reasons for the success of my blog was because I was talking about that as a young person. So if you can try and inject some of that culture of peer discussions into your workplace as well, then that will help your employees feel like it's not a boss hectoring to their employee, somebody, condescending or patronizing them, that actually it's about, young people talking to other young people, or Gen Xers talking to other Gen Xers, and so on.
So one of the things I hear quite a lot of at these events around mental health is a safe space, a safe place to go. One of the ideas that I was going to suggest as potentially, a resource or something that could be looked at would be having a financial first aider. And to your point here about having mental health first aiders, would it be good if there was people that could go and talk to role models or people like that within the business? And you talked about having a financial concierge, whether that's an external concierge that comes in and talks, or whether it's people that are trained up to do that internally. I think that would be a good next step, because when I look out there, and I don't know if you would agree, that the mental health story has gathered so much momentum, it feels that financial well-being is a bit far behind that with regards to people's financial health. It doesn't feel like it's getting the same level of coverage and attention potentially as mental health. So trying to find more ways. I think the other thing is the language that's used. That's really, really important. Again, today we're hearing, rather than mental health first aiders, there's allies, ambassadors, champions. Should we be getting that sort of language into like a positive framing of it, rather than, again, coming back to this sort of you need help, first aid? It kind of feels like someone's in help rather than sort of some of the positive imagery. And another idea that I basically stolen from the previous session that I was was the lady talked about A, B, C, D, E. I don't know if everyone was in that session. It was the first one this morning. But again, that was around awareness for A, be vigilant for B, culture for C, directing people for D, and then expertise for E would be equally applicable, I think, when it comes to people's financial well-being. So with the young people, Iona, how have they reacted to your blog? I mean, do you think they are genuinely, wanting to be engaged in this stuff, or is there still this kind of, I'd rather it was further away?
Oh no, there's definitely an increasing appetite for information and solidarity when it comes to young personal finance. And when I wrote my book, Spare Change, I was very keen to make sure that we moved away from talking about products, and we started talking much more about how people feel about money, the relationship that they have with money. And so I spent a lot of time in the book talking about what are your financial values, what are the things that you really cherish, and what are the things that really matter to you, and what is your money actually going on, and how are you being influenced by your peer group, by your family, by the media, by advertising, to spend your money in ways that actually don't really make you happy. And I think that how that feeds into the workplace is that you're quite right. We shouldn't just be constantly fighting fires and dealing with debt problems and when things get acute, although that's really important. We should also be trying to start at that much earlier stage of just helping people develop that better, more positive relationship with their finances. So I'm really interested by the work done by financial coaches. A lot of their work is not just about solving those practical problems, but about getting people to step back and understand what their values are, how they're using their money, what their long-term goals are, and how they can basically just feel better about their finances.
I think when it comes to finances, and financial well-being, there are a few things which I think is kind of really help people to feel better about it. One is that feeling of control, and quite often, whether it's finances or something else to do with our mental health, if we're not feeling in control of it, that's when the spiral starts to become quite negative. And I think your point about the financial coaches is really a good one, because they will help them feel in control by giving them a plan, something they can visualize. So rather than it just being a case of you need to save a certain amount, it's why they need to save that sort of money.
And there are some great tools now offered by the likes of Monzo and Starling, which allow people who have a gambling problem to put a block on any payments made to gambling firms. And it would be interesting to see whether or not we start to see that kind of technology spread out and help people who have compulsive behaviour in other areas. And I wonder whether or not something like that could have been really useful in your situation, whereby you could have done with having that framework that would help you, during those episodes, to really manage your financial behaviour better. And I just think the banking sector's got so much catching up to do in terms of actually helping people manage their behaviour, their real behaviour, how people really behave when it comes to money, as opposed to, imagining them to be robots.
No, agree. Rohan, perhaps you're going
to... I think absolutely agree with everything that's been said. And again, I think we talk about the workplace, and so much of it then spreads out societally and into the finance institutions. And what worries me is that it's still too easy for people in difficult financial situations to get access to credit.
Yeah.
And until we sort that out, as workplaces, we are still going to be picking up those types of pieces. London's a perfect example. You know, people will move down to London from university or study in London, and they will start their first grad job. They might be, 25 to 30K. I don't know how you can afford to live in London on that. And they're trying to live their life in such a way, they've got to pay their rent. They've got to go out for a beer on a Friday night with their colleagues. They've got to eat. They've got to pay contactless or Oyster card. I can't see a world in which that's achievable. And the challenge is, it's like we are telling our leaders in work, our HR leaders, our managers in the workplace, okay, look out for the symptoms of mental well-being, of poor mental well-being. And I think we need to start looking out for the symptoms of poor financial well-being when someone is, they might be losing weight, or someone may be constantly late, or, you see someone who lives about 4 miles from work who is walking instead of, cycling, or, whatever it may be. Let's just look for the societal symptoms which actually indicate that someone has those challenges.
And it's not just about symptoms as well, it's about the causes, and it comes back to what you were saying. Are there aspects of your workplace culture that could put real pressure on your employees, particularly at this time of year with Christmas? Do you have a culture that encourages everybody to kind of go to the pub after work on a Friday and spend actually quite a lot of money maybe that your employees can't really afford? Are they feeling under pressure within the company to keep up to a certain standard of behaviour, and that's causing them to spend more? Could you have that more flexible working policy that will not only help employees save on travel costs, but could also give them a bit of breathing space to get on top of their financial admin? Because what I tend to find is that people don't lack the kind of appetite to get on top of their money. It's just there's never a good time to do it. And when you're working full time, it's just a real struggle to find that half an hour or hour just to sort out your bills and sort out any financial admin. So actually encouraging your employees to take time out to do that could be a really progressive, enlightened thing for you to do.
And there's also probably a bit of denial as well. You almost don't want to find what's there, you know. And I know sort of somebody that did come to a financial planning session did come away feeling quite nervous now because they've got to look at it. But actually, at least it has, made it clear what they need to look at and how they might need to address that.
No, I think that's a good point. I think this intimidation, fear of, particularly if it's a financial advisor, sometimes, I've had the feedback that someone going to a financial advisor for the first time can feel a bit intimidated because effectively you're putting yourself on, at their mercy, and you're worried that they might come back and say, it's like all you've got, that kind of fear. So how you sort of destigmatise that sort of request for help, and I think the coaches do a good job of that because it's a bit less formal. I think the other challenge today, and it's, again, I keep coming back to young people, but I think it's everybody, it's the consumer society in which we live in. When I'm presenting, I often talk about my parents or grandparents, their generation, who wouldn't dream of buying a television, wouldn't dream of going on holiday unless they'd saved up for it first. But now we tend to pay for things, and then we come back, and then then we'll pay for it through the credit card. So again, trying to change people's behaviours, and that comes back to this A, B, C, D, E, the culture. You won't change culture, someone said, by getting external people in. It's got to come from internal. So how does that manifest itself in the workplace?
Yeah, because we're all in the same boat. We're all actually having to try and handle these pressures, and we all will cope with it at sometimes better than others. So I think if, as workplaces, we can all come together and try and talk about those pressures, and like I said before, if you've got younger people really openly discussing those pressures that you just described there, it's powerful because it helps other young people understand, well, I'm not alone. I've been thinking about this pressure recently, and I've been struggling with it, but now I know that somebody else is also worried about it and struggling with it. Then maybe actually I can start to think of some practical solutions.
It was Paul at Quilters in the first session talked about there is no mental health without financial well-being, and I think that it's the number one thing that people are most stressed about. So, someone said, how do you get started? Well, you just start, I think is what they said, is find a way to have that first conversation in the workplace, and be prepared for people to step forward. And
I think what Iona said earlier about peers, but most powerfully peers that come from within the management and leadership group, because they can really influence. I think we could have so many conversations around this. It could be around masculinity, it could be around finances, mental well-being. But when you have someone who is prepared to be vulnerable, and for me, I'm fortunate in so much, and I hope my workplace benefits because I do so much open speaking around mental well-being, financial well-being. As an ambassador for a mental health charity, I've been able to stand up in our workplace, which has therefore allowed that conversation to grow organically within the workplace. But it does start with someone, being brave enough to put their hand up and say, guys, it's okay.
And that was the message that came from Accenture, I think, in the first session, where you had strong leadership buy-in and not so strong. The impact that it had on the workforce was really significant. So, that, I think, so much that mirrors the mental health story that relates to financial well-being. Another example there. So we've got some questions coming in, and so I'll start with the one at the top. So first one's for you, Iona. I think you can probably read that. Is there a basic financial education tool that you'd recommend for teenagers?
That's a very good question. The answer is that there is no one education tool that will, help your teenagers understand money overnight. There are some good resources. I'd say there are some debit cards that you can get that are specifically for teenagers, like Go Henry, where parents can kind of oversee the spending of your teenager and kind of help them understand, the value of money from quite an early age. So that is actually a product that might help a teenager get to grips with money.
My kids have that.
Yeah?
She'll spend everything. I just go to say, do as I say, not as I do. Do here as well.
So that's a specific product. But in terms of resources, there's some interesting stuff being done actually by some of the banks out there that are specifically targeted at teenagers. And if you're looking for resources that will help you understand how to talk to teenagers about money, my bank is a great financial education charity, and they have quite a friendly, accessible bank of resources there, which could help you start some of those difficult conversations.
And Starling Bank, you mentioned them earlier, they're pretty good. My daughter's looking at them online. They've got quite good tools on there to help people with the early stages of budgeting and understanding about that too.
That's true, yeah.
So second question here, how do you handle conversations around employees' financial issues when you work for an asset manager or a finance firm, where this may lead to compliance issues? I don't mind taking that one because it's obviously a financial services type question. I don't think it's just relevant if it's an asset manager or finance firm. I think you have to be very careful when you're looking at finances and not be giving regulated financial advice. I think everyone's probably aware that that's a criminal offence, so you probably want to avoid that at all costs. And it comes back to the ABCD, is understanding where your skills lie and then where to direct people to get help. So I think, when you're talking about mental health as an issue, you're not a counsellor, you're not trained in psychotherapy in the same way. If you're not a financial advisor or a financial coach, or you've been trained in that area, then steer away from it, I would suggest is probably the best answer, and find a resource, either most likely to be external. I think if you have an internal resource, particularly an asset manager, I've come across this, and finance businesses, they're a little bit distrusting because they're worried that it's their own firm that might find out about them as potentially someone who's supposed to be managing money, potentially themselves needing help internally. There's concerns about that. So potentially an external third party might be a better resource there. So that's probably the best answer I can give on that, unless anyone else wants to add anything. And also you work in the legal sector, but it's not too dissimilar. Okay, so here's one. A team member is in severe debt and constantly asks for pay reviews and promotions. How can we support her when we can't currently give her the rise or the promotion? I'll start this off, but I think this is one for us to discuss. But I mean, we were talking to another client where there's a survey that we help employees, well, we offer to employees to complete, and it comes back and tells us, where employees' sort of needs are. And one business came back and there was a certain proportion of the population were severely in financial distress. And the main problem was that they were paying the minimum wage, and actually the business, the margins were very tight. So actually it created a problem that wasn't easily solvable. And I'm not sure necessarily it's easily solvable in a situation like this, but I think the first thing you'd have to say is to maybe talk to her a bit more about getting some help with the debt problem to begin with. I think going to the financial kind of 101 of financial planning is you pay off your debt first, and then before you start kind of any savings. So I think you have to have a conversation. Would you agree, Rohan? Or?
Yeah, look, it's two separate conversations. The first one absolutely is understanding the challenges of the debt challenge, understanding the impact of that on their working life, on their performance, and actually trying to signpost how we and external sources can support them through trying to overcome that. The other piece does have to come as part of, so for example, we do biannual salary reviews, and you have to be very, very clear with that individual, transparent as to what they need to achieve to be able to get the peer review promotion that they're looking to. You have to be absolutely black and white, separate that from the debt issue, and provide absolute full support for them to do that. And hope that the actual two come together, that by actually working on the debt challenge, you are empowering them to actually perform at the level that they need to actually get that promotion. But what you can't do is actually make that kind of decision based on something else, because you then create an inconsistency throughout the workplace.
Okay. One of the things that's been asked quite a lot to us in the past, and I'm sort of conscious about trying to be solutions focused, is other resources that's available. So LinkedIn's a pretty good place. We're involved in a LinkedIn group called Workplace Financial Wellbeing, and it's a friendly group, so by all means go and have a look and join in. But the premise behind that is that different providers of financial wellbeing solutions are there, and they share content and best practice. There's regular webinars. I think there's one later this week, this Wednesday, around building a financial wellbeing strategy. One of the things that we've seen is people look at financial wellbeing for the first time and then not quite sure where to go because there's so many, and then they pick one of the free ones just to have a go to see how it works out, and then don't quite get the results they're looking for, and then they sort of think, maybe I should try something else to go off in a different direction. So I think one of the things that we would suggest to people is have a look at trying to create a strategy, something you can then measure rather than just having a go at something. So by all means have a look at Workplace Financial Wellbeing on LinkedIn. I can't see that last question, so we're getting that to the top because I was told there was.
I think I've probably got an idea around that bottom one, mind you.
Okay. So one of the last questions I think we've probably got time for is, are there best practices to follow during exits or redundancies to help people with the financial implications in their change of employment status? Looking at you for that one, Vicky, whether you've got any on that as our HR operations person.
I mean, we provide kind of outplacement services as somebody's leaving the firm. I guess that's more around probably finding new employment as opposed to kind of the legalities or things around redundancies. But I think it kind of comes back to probably that holistic approach again, that we, all of this is great, and if we've got, a solution for what to do with your finances, that's great, but actually it's all the other things it's created in the meantime as well. So, picking up to answer sort of another question that had popped up a little while ago, it's disappeared now, but about how do you plan that financial wellbeing program? I think you've got to think of all those demographics and perhaps all these different scenarios, and we just try and kind of pluck things from all those different topics and provide some information and education around all of that. And then it can be, even wider still around, we've talked about mindfulness earlier today, and sort of sleep and all those sorts of things, because all of these financial issues will create the problems in these different areas. So I guess I haven't probably got a finite answer to that particular one, I'm afraid. But yeah, I think just it's hopefully we can provide advice again with our EAP. We provide sort of 3 months after somebody's left in that situation that they can call upon and use that service.
Yeah, and I'd add to that your point about integrating with other aspects, whatever your wellbeing program is, and it's very easy to sit up here and say, yeah, it shouldn't just be a wellbeing day or a wellbeing week, but it needs to be embedded and spread over.
Yeah.
It's very easy to say that. I appreciate there's a limited amount of resource sometimes, but I would always say someone would prefer you did a week than you did nothing. But ultimately, you want to be trying to find a way to extend this out over a longer period if you can, and embed it with the other wellbeing programs.
Could I just make one last very constructive suggestion? Talk to your local credit unions. Talk to financial education charities, talk to debt advice charities, find out more about the Money and Mental Health Policy Institute that does a huge amount of research in this area. Go out and find those resources, and you might find there's a lot of scope for partnerships, link-ups, for people from those organisations to come into yours and speak about these issues, and that could be a really fruitful way to progress this whole area.
Perfect. Thanks for finishing up that nicely, Simon.
Thank you very much.